buy almost 1,000 new tanks from South Korea and some 600 mobile howitzers. These are effectively, they look to you and I like large tanks, big tracked vehicles with enormous guns, but they're more cumbersome, a bit slower, but they have a much larger range. Poland is rearming, and I suspect it's possible that the Prime Minister's comments yesterday may be a reflection of conversations happening in the background along the lines of whether or not some of this new materiel coming, this new military supplies coming from South Korea should be donated straight to Ukraine, and Poland appearing reluctant to do that.
President Biden insists his country stands united with Kyiv and has approved a new support package for Ukraine. Mr. Zelensky says there's not a soul in the country that doesn't feel gratitude.
Ukrainians, Americans, we do not betray ourselves. We do not betray freedom. Let our open hearts win.
Well, the Ukrainian president is in the US to shore up support as unease about aid grows amongst Republicans. Earlier this week, of course, Poland said it would stop sending arms to Ukraine over a grain dispute. Let's speak to Jerome Starkey. He's the Sun's defence editor and he's in the city of Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine. Good morning, Jerome.
Good morning, Chloe.
Before we get into the politics of all this, just tell us what the situation is in Zaporizhia right now.
Well, the situation remains largely unchanged in the sense that Ukraine is continuing to launch its very, very difficult, very, very costly and ultimately slow-moving counter-offensive against the very well dug-in Russian front lines in this province and elsewhere. Ukraine's biggest successes in the last few weeks have actually come not on the battlefield, not as they assault Russian trenches, but more spectacularly much deeper behind Russian lines with cruise missile strikes last week on a Russian naval base in Crimea, and we understand reports emerging of possible attacks against a Russian power station. That's still to be confirmed. Russia, meanwhile, retaliating with this week with one of the largest strikes, the first strike on Ukraine's energy infrastructure for 6 months. A barrage of some 40-plus cruise missiles fired across the country, 37 of them being shot down, Ukraine's Air Force says, but nonetheless 6 getting through, and that triggered a wave of blackouts in Ukraine yesterday.
Gosh. Let's talk about Washington. Obviously, President Zelensky has gone over to speak to President Biden. He's managed to secure some more cash, but he must be concerned, and Ukrainians must be concerned about this, well, unease amongst Republicans of keeping writing checks. Jerome, can you hear me? I think Jerome's line has probably dropped off. It's understandable. It's obviously difficult sometimes to connect through with Zaporizhia in southeastern Ukraine. I think one of the big issues that we'll get into with Jerome Starkey is this idea amongst some Republicans in the US that actually they can't keep writing checks for Ukraine. There's been a huge amount, $100 billion already given to Ukraine. Now, that is a tiny amount of the kind of defence budget of the United States, but it's a huge amount of money. And when you think of it in political terms, that next year there is obviously going to be a presidential election. It's difficult to know at the moment who is going to be the Republican candidate, but polls would suggest Trump's got a very good chance. Polls would also suggest if Trump was the candidate, he's got a good chance of becoming president again. And it will be interesting to see how the strategy changes towards Ukraine. And that must be a concern for Zelensky and the Ukrainian people.
I think that's also something that you need to look out for, is the sort of the tensions in domestic politics that could mean that international support for Ukraine diminishes. It has been a long-running conflict already in terms of modern standards and by any modern measure. And so actually, does that mean that fraying domestic politics means diminishing support?
Be interesting to look at that. Jerome's back with us, Jerome Starkey, the Sun's defence editor. Jerome, how much concern is there in Ukraine that actually the money might not keep flowing from the US, particularly with this reticence from some Republicans?
I think there's a very real understanding, and indeed it was expressed in America yesterday, that without American support, Ukraine would not be able to prosecute the war, certainly not in the way that it's fighting at the moment. And indeed, its prospect of defeating Russia would almost certainly evaporate. It might be able to lead to some sort of stalemate. So deep concern here in Ukraine, indeed, and we've heard this concern expressed by British officials as well, one saying that Vladimir Putin's strategy is to rely on a change of heart, a significant change of heart, and possibly even a change of president in America. If there is an isolationist government in the White House that pulls up the drawbridge across the Atlantic, then that would be very, very bad news for Ukraine indeed.
And we mustn't forget as well the dynamic here of Poland this week saying it's going to stop sending arms to Ukraine. And this is all over the grain deal, isn't it?
That's right. Comments from Poland's Prime Minister saying that Poland is going to stop sending weapons to Ukraine. I mean, clearly a really stark comment that will have has triggered unease here in Poland. Now, this is should be seen in the context of two things. There is a long-running now and fairly bitter dispute between Poland and Ukraine over grain, and that's because Russia has largely closed Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, so a lot of its grain cannot be exported by sea. It's going over land instead, and it's going into Central Europe, and countries including Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, complaining that glut, that unexpected rise in Ukrainian grain imports has collapsed prices for its farmers. Now, that's become an acute domestic political issue for those countries, and what we're seeing is their politicians reacting to the needs of their own voters. But the Polish comment should also be seen in terms of Poland's spectacular and substantial support for Ukraine already. Poland has given Ukraine more than 300 tanks. It supplied MiG-29 fighter jets, helicopters, armored personnel carriers, many of which were the old Soviet-era designs which Poland had in its arsenals, indeed which Ukraine's armed forces were familiar with already. And that was immensely useful to Ukraine because its soldiers knew how to operate that kit. They could absorb it immediately, and indeed they were donated quickly over the course of this year and last year when Ukraine needed it. Now, what Poland is planning to do as a result is to buy almost 1,000 new tanks from South Korea and some 600 mobile howitzers. These are effectively, they look to you and I like large tanks, big tracked vehicles with enormous guns, but they're more cumbersome, a bit slower, but they have a much larger range. Poland is rearming, and I suspect it's possible that the Prime Minister's comments yesterday may be a reflection of conversations happening in the background along the lines of whether or not some of this new materiel coming, this new military supplies coming from South Korea should be donated straight to Ukraine, and Poland appearing reluctant to do that. South Korea is emerging as perhaps one of the key suppliers. South Korea does not supply Ukraine directly, but it is one of the countries around the world that has a sophisticated, large arms manufacturing industry that could, if directed, help Ukraine meet its need for arms and ammunition.
Jerome, really good to speak to you as ever. Thank you. That's Jerome Starkey. He is the Sun's defence editor. He is speaking to us from the city of Zaporizhzhia in southeastern Ukraine.